Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. Today we're doing a special episode, and we have two special guests for that special episode. So I'm, of course, joined by, I think, returning for his second time actually on the show, Mr. Nick Hudson from Pandemics Data and Analysis, PANDA, as everyone knows it. Nick, how are you? How are things going?
Very well, dismayed, obviously, by what's going on in the country at the moment, and freezing cold here in Eisner. But otherwise, in good spirits, thank you.
Yeah, same here with the cold, same here with the dismay about the country. And of course, we're also joined by Daily Friend writer and IR Council member Ivo Vegter. Ivo, how are you doing?
I'm very well, and yourself, Nicholas? I'm not dismayed. I'm delighted about the state of the country. It can only bring about the more rapid demise of the ANC, which is really what.
I certainly hope so, because otherwise, we really can't go on like this.
Yeah.
So, of course, why do we have these two gentlemen here with us today? Well, we're going to be talking about COVID, and we're going to be talking about PANDA, and we're going to be talking about sort of the way this debate has gone and all that sort of thing. And, of course, COVID has been with us now for a while, and has caused an enormous amount of disruption to societies around the world, and it's caused a lot of heated debate. I remember that Nick from PANDA made waves in the early days, and as did Ivo, both writing against lockdowns. So, gentlemen, let me start with that kind of basic, and we will get to in a little bit some places where you guys disagree quite strongly on how things are at the moment. So, Nick, let me start with you. What was the beginning of your analysis? How has it changed over time? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, Nicholas, we started really with the simple observation that there was a massive departure between what the media was portraying and the reality on the ground, and that nowhere was it discernible that any of the governments of the world or public health institutions who were mandating these draconian policies had done any sort of form of cost-benefit analysis. So we simply drew attention to the fact that there were massive economy-mediated public health consequences to lockdown that nobody was even speaking about, let alone analyzing. And that was the starting point of a journey that has largely involved us trying to bring an air of proportionality to the discussion in the face of media and public health institutions who have done nothing but drive a narrative of fear that is disproportionate to the risk that is actually confronted, and that we believe has been more deadly than the virus itself.
And Ivo, you had similar observations at the beginning of the pandemic.
Yeah, I did. Very much the same as PANDA, actually. At the start of the pandemic, I was a big fan. I thought they did excellent work in challenging the exaggerated forecasts of the government modelers. They managed to forecast the first wave much better than any of the government modelers had. They were very good at opposing crazy lockdown rules and at pointing out that the economic consequences of lockdown were severe and had not been taken into account at all. As Nick said, there was no cost-benefit analysis. The only benefit that the government looked at was the supposed limiting the spread of COVID. If that could be achieved, and if the hospitals could be prevented from being overwhelmed, then that was sufficient to justify literally any cost, and the cost ran into billions. So, I disagreed with that, as did Nick. I argued that we were marching meekly and fearfully into totalitarianism. Governments around the world exploited the pandemic to severely curtail civil liberties and advance authoritarian rule, and especially in South Africa, with our ominously named National Coronavirus Command Council, which at one point I declared not fit to rule. I did take COVID seriously. Although, frankly, I'm taking it even more seriously now than I did then. Scientists that were advising the government were speaking out against lockdown, saying that even after the initial 3 weeks, they said that extending the lockdown wouldn't help. They call the government's regulation unscientific and nonsensical. I agreed entirely, and I shared the view of Glenda Gray, Dr. Glenda Gray, who said that the lockdown should be lifted completely in favor of non-pharmaceutical interventions such as hand washing, wearing masks, social distancing, and prohibitions on gatherings. And I still hold this view. So until this point, I was largely in agreement with PANDA.
Okay. But points of disagreement have emerged between both of you. So I believe that the initial impetus for this discussion was a dispute that you had on Twitter, that most wonderful of platforms. I used to be on it, but I'm no longer on it, because, of course, it's very much filled with a lot of very interesting rhetoric. But Ivo, you said that Nick was a conspiracy theorist. So you agree on a lot of stuff about lockdowns and things like that. Why were you criticizing PANDA? What was the basis of your criticism? And then we'll hear from Nick his response.
Well, it was an offhand remark, and I probably should have qualified it fairly significantly. I have a cat on my back.
It's better than a panda.
Yeah, I think we'll just ignore the cat.
The cat also wants to be in the show. Look, I thought, and I already thought by the second half of last year, between the first and the second waves, that the wheels were kind of coming off a little at PANDA. I think as it grew, it attracted a number of people with what I thought were fairly dubious views. I thought it became increasingly shrill about the theory that sort of the whole pandemic was just based on lies and deceit. And then when vaccines did become available, PANDA was advocating fairly strongly against vaccination, with which I just couldn't agree. I've got a number of specific issues which I'd love to cover if we have the time. But I really thought that PANDA was becoming a bit of a denialist, and in some cases conspiracist group. There was a lot of talk about Gates-funded people, and the Klaus Schwab is mentioned. And that sort of just rubbed me up the wrong way.
So, Nick, do you agree with some of what Ivo said, or do you disagree completely? Where do you see this?
No, I disagree completely. I mean, our policy on vaccinations as it stands right now is similar to our policy with respect to lockdown, that a doctrine of focused protection would be the proportionate route. And this very rabid zealotry around trying to put a jab in every arm is misplaced in the case of experimental medications that have only been through the very small trials with very dubious results. The risk to the young and to recovered individuals, who represent more than half of the population presented by COVID, is negligible. And so our view is that vaccination should be confined to the vulnerable minority. And that's it, simple as that. So that does not constitute an anti-vax position or a vaccine hesitant position. I don't like either of these terms, and I think they're terms that are used by the extreme pole of one side of the argument in an attempt to discredit without addressing the arguments. And our arguments are strong. We wrote a very well-resourced paper that has gone viral, demonstrating the case for natural immunity and showing that the risk-benefit analysis is out of whack for vaccinating recovered individuals. And we have written a very detailed document called the Declaration for Protection of Children and the Youth, which includes the argument that vaccines should not be forced upon them. And that's our position at the moment. We of course, reserve our right to change our minds. That's what good science people do, and when presented with good arguments. But one of the things that's emerging for us that's been of enormous concern is the massive emergence of post-mass vaccination inception resurgences in country after country around the world. There are some 30 countries that have, in many cases, almost no epidemic for a year. And then as soon as they commence mass vaccination programs, you have an unprecedented and alarming resurgence in coronavirus, taking it to orders of magnitude greater levels than was experienced before the vaccine.
And to what do you attribute that?
Good. Well, the prevailing theory, and it's one that we are studying quite hard right now, is that immediately after vaccination, people experience an immune suppressed state. And this is visible in blood work, so it's not some trumped up theory. You can see dendrite counts fall. And I think in that process, what happens is you increase susceptibility and susceptibility to a more severe disease course. And this, when you look at the drug, the vaccine studies conducted by the manufacturers, what you find in their protocols is that they excluded from the studies anybody who tested positive for coronavirus in the 14 days after the first or second dose. And this is a major flaw in the trial design, because what that does is it removes from the vaccine arm the most susceptible individuals, so thereby distorting and invalidating, in our opinion, the entire study. Now, this biased removal of people from the vaccine arm was reported on by none other than Peter Doshi, editor of the British Medical Journal, who demanded that Pfizer should release its underlying data. And he did that in January of this year. Pfizer has never responded, and we find that deeply suspicious.
All right, hold on. Can I interject there, please?
Yes.
You may.
Doshi has a PhD in history, anthropology, and science, technology, and society. Right. He has no qualifications in any field even remotely related to vaccines. He has no research and publications recorded in any field related to vaccines. He is a well-known anti-vax conspiracy theorist, right, with the bully pulpit on the editorial board of the BMJ, as you said. He's one of the editors. He's not the only one. His posts questioning the efficacy of COVID-19 vaccines are pretty much devoid of evidence. They are opinion. They are not peer-reviewed, and they are not endorsed by the British Medical Journal. So, saying that, he is the editor of the BMJ, I think that's giving him a little bit too much credence.
But did you see the move you just? Did you see the move you just pulled there?
Yes, I did. I went straight.
Let's hear Nick. Let's hear Nick respond.
You went straight to the credentials and not to the argument.
I did.
So you don't think that it's unusual, Ivo, to have in a double-blind trial where you expect protocol variations to be uniformly distributed across both arms of the study, to have a 10-to-1 bias, at least 10-to-1 bias in one arm of the study, with a plausible mechanistic explanation, as I've just given you, for that removal? I mean, I find that quite extraordinary.
Right. I don't think it's that extraordinary, actually. If vaccines say they're only effective 14 days after the vaccine, then it makes sense to only record responses to COVID infection 14 days after the vaccination was given. That makes sense, because you are as vulnerable as an unvaccinated person until those 14 days have expired. That's of course not exactly true. That's of course not exactly true, but
that would be reasonable if you expected similar levels of COVID infection in the vaccinated and unvaccinated group. If you're going to strip them out of the study, because there's no
fair enough. You argue that in those 14 days you are more susceptible to COVID-19, and therefore those 14 days ought to be studied.
Yes.
I saw a Twitter thread that you promoted yesterday, which claimed to analyze a study that shows that post-vaccination deaths within 14 days actually cancel out the benefit that vaccinated people gain, and they are therefore at equal risk as unvaccinated people. Now that goes a lot further than what you've just been saying.
Yes, this is a question that should be answered.
And that goes to something that you said back in April, that you suggested that vaccines didn't work. Now, this sort of flatly contradicts the basic numbers. I mean, let's just take some simple available numbers, right? Deaths reported on the vaccine adverse events reporting system in the US, right? I don't put a lot of credence to that number. I think that that number is highly exaggerated, and probably many of them don't have anything to do with vaccination at all. But let's assume right, that the 5,000 plus deaths that are recorded on the VAERS system in the US are all caused by vaccination. Right. Then you do the simple maths. There have been 623,000 confirmed COVID deaths in the US. Population is 333 million. Gives you a crude mortality rate of 0.2%. So if you are an American, right, whether or not you get COVID, your risk of dying of COVID is 0.2%. The number of vaccines administered in the US is 334 million, almost exactly the same as the number of people in the US, although obviously not on a one-to-one correspondence. So assuming that all the 5,000 plus VAERS death reports are attributable to vaccination, you get a crude mortality of no more than 0.002%. Right? That's 2 orders of magnitude lower than the crude mortality due to COVID-19 on the most generous assumptions. Now, if it was true that in the 14 days post-vaccination, people are so much more vulnerable to COVID and are dying as a result, then surely that should turn up in the VAERS reports.
None of the COVID deaths are being included in the VAERS reports. But let me just address a couple of points here.
What do you mean?
There's been a report of 256 COVID deaths following vaccination that were not included in the VAERS reports. This is the one. Okay, let's just take a step back.
Hold on. 256.
Yes.
So you want me? So you want me to?
That was studied.
So you want me to increase the 5,000 that I just mentioned by 256?
No, of course not, Ivo.
Because I'm glad we do that.
That would be ridiculous.
No, but then I don't understand. Then I don't understand your claim.
Sorry, Ivo.
If you would allow me to speak, I will be able to explain. Okay. First of all, the VAERS report does not even pretend to be an exhaustive capturing of vaccine events. It's a signaling system. The level of adverse events with respect to this vaccination per capita of vaccination is unprecedented. It is without precedent in the history of the system. It is not pretending to be an exhaustive capture tool. Yes, I agree with you. There may well be events on that system that are not, in fact, causally related to the vaccine, and those will, in time, hopefully, be removed. But that doesn't mean that it's an overestimate. It could well be a vast underestimate, especially if, as the preliminary investigation suggests, COVID deaths immediately following vaccination are not being recorded on the system. And just also, again, let's just slow down. What we are saying is that this phenomenon ought to be studied and assessed, because we're getting widespread reports from doctors. I had another one calling me this morning saying he has patient after patient coming in immediately after vaccination, presenting with severe COVID. If this is a phenomenon, then it has a public health implication all of its own. The implication may not be that you stop the vaccination program. It may be that the public health communication around this needs to firm up so that people who have been recently vaccinated are told to isolate and to be very, very careful because they are more susceptible. That could be the answer here. I'm not saying that this means suspend the vaccination program. But the fact that the studies were designed to exclude these people means that you can't make the conclusions anymore about the 95% efficacy. There may well be a long-term benefit, but there may not be if you've taken all the susceptible people out of the vaccine arm by removing them because they got COVID in the first 14 days. That would bias the study terrifically.
Well, you are promoting claims that say that there is no benefit to being vaccinated.
I'm not promoting claims that saying there's no benefit. I'm pointing to a study that suggests that this phenomenon has slanted the whole analysis.
Yes, and that conclusion in that thread that you promoted, and that you called, what was it, the story of the decade, was that vaccinated people are at equal risk as unvaccinated people because of their increased risk shortly after vaccination.
That was what one study suggested. And I think the points raised in that study are extremely, extremely good. And it is a disgrace that issues like this are not being picked up in our media. There should be robust debate. There should be engagement around quality information. Let me ask you this question, Ivo. To what do you attribute these massive resurgences?
I haven't seen a lot of evidence of massive resurgences, actually.
You haven't looked at Cambodia, Vietnam, Seychelles?
I've looked at the Seychelles. I've looked at the Seychelles. Yes. In all of those cases, the number of people vaccinated in the country, right, are not sufficient to prevent resurgences, right? Especially not when a new variant, which is more transmissible and perhaps less susceptible to vaccines, who knows, is around. So very few, if any, countries, I think, have reached herd immunity through vaccination. So that outbreaks still happen actually isn't at all far-fetched or surprising. And what also happens is when you get people queuing to get vaccinated, of course you are at risk of creating super spreader events. This is a major management problem, actually, for every single vaccination site, is to keep them ordered in such a way that not too many people turn up at the same time, that when they do turn up at the same time, they are properly distanced, so that these events themselves don't become COVID spreaders. So that may be a significant risk with COVID vaccination centers, and that may entirely explain the phenomenon that you're seeing.
So I have a question. Yes. I have a question. This is those countries. So I have not looked so into the data here. So I'm just curious as to what your thoughts are. All those countries you listed, are those all ones that use primarily Sinovac as their vaccination things? Are they not?
No,
that was the story I had read about the Seychelles in particular, was that they had heavily favored Sinovac.
No,
the Seychelles did, yeah.
Yeah, the Seychelles had two vaccines going, Pfizer and Sinovac. There is a mixture of vaccines involved in this. I mean, it's beyond those two. We are talking about some 30 countries. This is not like an isolated phenomenon in one or two countries that have used predominantly one or the other vaccine. And the disturbing thing about this is even pointing this out is liable to getting you thrown off Twitter, just asking questions about what is going on. So the whole debate gets completely stifled. It hasn't even been mentioned in South Africa. Neighboring Namibia, Uganda, all experiencing exactly the same thing. And again, doctors reporting to us that immediately after vaccination, they have patients who are coming down with severe COVID. This is just not something that ought to be thrown under the rug, because it may induce vaccine hesitancy. It has important public health consequences if the theory is correct.
But Nick, your whole public rhetoric is against vaccination. They say vaccinations don't work.
No.
And all of these things, sort of finding reasons why the vaccinations are dangerous or whatever, or don't work. That all just plays into that narrative.
Yeah, my public narrative is definitely not that vaccines don't work, Ivo. Our stated policy is that vaccines should be confined to the vulnerable minority, and that it is a type of disturbia that we are even contemplating mandatory vaccination, vaccine passports, coerced vaccination, and vaccination of children who are simply not vulnerable to the disease. That's our stance.
Who's talking about coercion?
It's been spoken about in every major newspaper in the world.
In South Africa. No. South Africa is not coercing anyone. We're not proposing to coerce anyone. As soon as they coerce people, I'll be right there with you saying people shouldn't be coerced.
Now, we've had the former head of the MAC, the CEO of Discovery, all saying that your life is going to be miserable if you're unvaccinated. Get vaccinated, because we are going to make sure that you can't travel, that you can't visit places, that you can't get a job. That's the tone of all of this. And yes, we can split hairs about whether that constitutes mandatory vaccination or coerced vaccination. In my book, it does. Yesterday, you had Macron, and the day before, the Greek Prime Minister, I've forgotten his name right now, talking about incredibly draconian impositions. And what we've noticed, as with lockdowns, is these bad ideas have a habit of spreading around the world because of the way this COVID response has been orchestrated with these organizations who, yes, I do mention frequently, having an overbearing influence over our institutions of media and public health. So I don't find this at all unrealistic to have the debate at this stage. It's not as if somebody has come out and said, listen, we are never going to mandate. It's going to be illegal, as they have done in Florida, made it illegal for vaccination passports to be imposed privately or publicly. There's nothing reassuring in this discussion for me. The whole thing takes on the same draconian air as lockdowns and mask mandates have done.
Right, and as I said, I would be against vaccine mandates, certainly.
Good.
Granted, I would also leave private individuals and companies free to choose how they deal with customers that are not vaccinated, whether they require vaccinations, for the use of their premises, for example.
Good.
I could entirely see a pub owner being uncomfortable with having a full crowd in a pub when he knows that there are unvaccinated people among them that may be carrying COVID, and that's their right as private property owners, of course.
Yeah, I get that, but I also think that the continued misinformation of the public feeds into this. For example, there is this recurrent theme that vaccine immunity is somehow superior to natural immunity. That is just manifestly false. There are no solid studies suggesting that at all. It's not even an expectation. In the entirety of public health before COVID, if you'd asked anybody whether this would be a reasonable expectation, anybody with reasonable expertise in the area, they would have turned around and said, no, of course not. Natural immunity is vastly superior, broader, longer duration than vaccine-induced immunity. But the messaging goes out that natural immunity is inferior, that vaccine-induced immunity is crucial, and therefore that it's reasonable to have a vaccine requirement, that a person marching in with an antibody test or a history of having had the disease would not be good enough, that person must go and get vaccinated too, even though there are numerous doctors around the world who argue that vaccine should be contraindicated in recovered individuals.
Yeah, I can't speak to that because, sorry, Nicholas?
Sorry, on that point, would you be more comfortable with something like a vaccine passport, or I don't know, let's say a pub, let's take the example of the pub using not wanting to let in vaccinated people, if people also, instead of a vaccination thing, produced a positive COVID test from like 3 months ago or something, do you think that would be of...
I don't think any of this is necessary, and it's part of the manic response to this virus. So I'm uncomfortable with any of these steps. The only reason these things are being contemplated is because our public health institutions have done the most shocking job of inflaming a narrative of fear and promoting that in the interests of their big pharma funders. And this is a shocking state of affairs. Coronavirus will become an endemic background disease like many other viruses that we have lived with in the past. It makes no sense to put this one under a microscope and suddenly run around impinging on people's freedoms and rights simply because there was a mania. We need to get off of this. We need to get off of this fast. It is nonsense.
But Nick, you said that last year after the first wave. Right, you said there wouldn't be a second wave. This would just become a seasonal endemic thing and nothing to worry about. You said there would be a big second wave scare campaign, right, but there wouldn't be a second wave.
It was.
In August, you approvingly retweeted someone who referred to second wave wingnuts. In October, you said South Africa's COVID season is over. There won't be a second wave this summer. In November, you called Professor Salim Abdul Karim a liar, saying that he knew very well there would be no second wave. In fact, you called him an enemy of our nation for warning about it. An interview with Dr. Mike Yaden, a member of your scientific advisory board, which you posted on the PANDA website on the 9th of November, said that viruses don't do waves. In fact, anyone with a computer can establish for themselves, and thus there is no second wave. Now, all of these predictions were never clearly retracted. The only sort of correction that I could find. Okay.
No, I mean we did more than retracted. We did a 1.5 hour erratum video that was published onto our website and promoted on social media.
That's what I was about to say. The only sort of correction I could find was buried in a video, right, posted in February 2021, right, where it's unsearchable, right, which said that PANDA expected a much smaller second wave to occur only in the autumn. But that isn't what you predicted. You didn't say there'd be a small second wave in the autumn.
No,
you said there would be no second wave at all.
We predicted that there would be endemic fluctuations, which implies waves, but we called them, we referred to them as wavelets, that the thing would decrease in volume. For example,
but
as it has done, it has. If you look at Khayelitsha, where social distancing and lockdowns were impossible, that's exactly what has happened. They had a much smaller.
And if you look at South Africa, the second wave was much bigger than the first wave. Okay, and the third wave was also much bigger than the first wave.
Yeah, okay, so let me point out a couple of things. South Africa's situation is very unprecedented, is without peer in the rest of the world. We're the only country that has exhibited this phenomenon. It was a very strange set of circumstances, and I think it'll take a long time to unpick exactly what the reasons were. That we were not alone in making that forecast. The NICD itself had said that they expected that the Western Cape was at or close to herd immunity going into December, and that turned out also not to be true. Okay, so I think let's just put this all into proportion. What is fully expected, and I think is now becoming clear all over the place, is that once you build up a stock of people who have accumulated natural immunity, the wave's size decreases. What happened in South Africa is difficult to assess. A possibility is that a portion of our population isolated successfully and preserved a sufficient number of immunely naive people who then sustained, when they came out into the open in December, launched another wave, that there were sufficient of them around to spur an unseasonal wave. That's a possibility. We also have published and promoted models explaining how precisely this phenomenon would emerge in the event of partially effective lockdowns. That as we've discussed and promoted several times, the models built by Federico Luis and Levin Jeperidze. We think that those models are very good descriptions of what has gone on in places where there have been strong and long duration lockdowns. And bear in mind too, that this is a prediction of basic epidemiology, that long lockdowns will result in higher mortality. So we could just as easily be seeing in our December wave the results of a very ill-advised strategy of locking down in the first place.
Yeah, that's well, I'm not even sure that that's plausible, but this is a lot of post hoc rationalization. What bugged me about that whole episode is that your statements were not in the nature of hypotheses. Right? You don't tell a professor that he is lying through his teeth and he's an enemy of the nation if all you're doing is floating a seasonality hypothesis. You made some very firm predictions, which turned out to be very much mistaken.
We made one prediction. We made one prediction which turned out to be mistaken. And let's look at the context of that. In December, our Minister of Health comes on national television and tells the nation that everybody is at equal risk now. And sitting alongside that very professor who I criticized, who didn't raise a single objection. A week later, we get the admissions statistics at the hospitals. What do we find out? That the average age has actually increased. The average age of admission has actually increased. Those gentlemen were lying in order to promote a narrative of fear. That has been the public health methodology here, and I will not apologize for those statements. It was in the context of those lies that I made those statements.
You're not claiming that someone else lied, that the minister lied.
The Minister of Health, yes, they all have. Ivo, these are let me list the things that these people have been lying about. Universal susceptibility, a lie. Asymptomatic transmission as a driver of the epidemic, a lie. Lockdown efficacy, a lie. Mask efficacy, a lie.
All right, hold on. Let's just take one of those.
Universal susceptibility. Let's go for it.
Asymptomatic transmission.
As a driver of the
universal susceptibility, I agree with you. There's no such thing as universal susceptibility. There are obviously people who are more susceptible than others.
So why did they maintain that lie?
I don't know. I can't answer you on that one. On that one, You're correct. On that one, you're quite correct. That wasn't what this was about. This was about the second wave. But let's take the other one you mentioned, asymptomatic transmission. I did a Google Scholar search this morning on asymptomatic transmission of SARS-CoV-2. Every single one of the first page matches says that asymptomatic transmission is possible and indeed common. Right? One of them estimates that it accounts for more than half of all transmission. Another said it seems to account for approximately 40 to 45% of SARS-CoV-2 infections. Right? And that these asymptomatic patients can transmit the virus to others for an extended period, perhaps longer than 14 days. Now, how do you explain that Google Scholar is full of studies that claim that asymptomatic transmission happens and is common when you say that's not a thing?
That's a very reasonable a very reasonable question. Let me just clarify. What I'm saying is it's not a driver of the disease epidemic. Okay, so that's a distinct thing from saying that it's not a thing. It's not a driver of the disease epidemic is the claim that we make. And what is very important in this regard, if you go through the entirety of the literature on asymptomatic transmission, this is what you find. There are one or two very, very weak papers, one of which should actually be retracted, that promote the idea for the first time of asymptomatic transmission being a driver of the epidemic. The one of those two papers involved a single woman from China who was on a business trip to Germany and purportedly infected her colleagues while she was asymptomatic. It turned out, in fact, that she was being treated for flu-like illness. But this was one of the two seminal papers that led to the calibration of all these models determining that asymptomatic transmission was a driver. They calibrated these models out of the ether. There are no solid calibrations based on actual data on asymptomatic transmission. The one robust study that we've managed to find was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association and completely vindicates what we have been saying, that asymptomatic transmission accounts for a very small percentage of total transmissions of infections, let alone disease, and that this was even true within household contexts where duration of exposure is extremely long. So we are very firm in saying that this whole story of asymptomatic transmission as a driver of the disease epidemic has been nothing but a fraud.
So the 10 out of 10 papers on the front page of Google Scholar that say
yes,
it does happen, you think they're all wrong?
Yes, if you go under those papers, what you will find is that they make an assumption at the bottom of it all. They make an assumption about the probability of transmission from an asymptomatic person. It's an assumption. So what you've got is a model that concludes 40 or 50 or whatever percent you're reading there. But the model, that conclusion is ordained in the axiomatic. Is not based data. That is systematically what you find here.
Okay, look, I'm not an expert, so if you're going to dispute all those papers, then fine. I'm not an expert. I'm not an epidemiologist or a virologist. I just look at the scientific data that is presented to me when I look for it, and
that's not data.
All of them seems to suggest that you're the one in the wrong, and you claim that all these scientists are in the wrong. All right, fair enough.
All right.
Okay, but you also need to understand. Let's take another one, because we can play the same trick here. Fomite and droplet transmission.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there isn't an iota of support for this idea, yet it underpinned both the mask mandates and the 6 feet rules of social distancing.
Yes, and I think at the time it followed the best knowledge at the time. You'll see there's a lot less of a focus on sanitizing surfaces these days than there was in the beginning. At the time that was the best available knowledge.
No, it wasn't. At the time, what we knew about respiratory viruses was that they were distributed by airborne aerosols. This was known. It was completely fabricated, made up, that there was a fomite and droplet story going on.
So who fabricated it and why?
The people who okay. So here we get into the domain of why anybody would want to induce a lockdown, and I have no doubt that you've heard me speak several times about this. The story regarding lockdowns is, I believe, embedded in an ideology, not in, as you've accused me of earlier, a conspiracy. Okay. There is a perspective in public health which takes on a centralist command and control type approach, the dream of managing to improve our lots as citizens of the world by means of surveillance, by means of mandatory vaccination and immunity passports, by means of repeated lockdown in response to whatever happens to be declared as an epidemic tomorrow, whether or not it's a completely bogus one, such as the 2009 H1N1 swine flu non-epidemic, or this one, which should never have been declared an epidemic. And that school of thought has become dominant in public health and in these supranational organizations all around the world. And it just surprises me that you can't see that.
Really, this should never have been declared an epidemic.
The mortality rate.
What are all these people dying of, Nick?
They're dying of a respiratory virus. But the response, allow me to finish.
Called SARS-CoV-2.
Okay. Let's take the infection fatality rate for this disease, estimated by the most comprehensive study published by the World Health Organization itself, is 0.15%. For healthy people below the age of 70, we have a disease that has an infection fatality rate that is probably below 0.01%. We have treated this disease like an airborne Ebola. It was only by virtue of an amendment to the World Health Organization's pandemic definition that this thing was able to be declared a pandemic in the first place. We believe that the death rate would have been far lower if none of these draconian measures had been introduced, and if public health institutions had done something other than promote a narrative of fear, which in itself is a deadly story. So if you look at countries that have had more measured responses, the death rates are much lower than the ones I've just cited, even lower than those. And this is what we believe would have emerged if we hadn't gone in for any of this malarkic response. It has been an unnecessary exercise from the beginning.
You see, that doesn't make any sense to me. I've got sort of first-hand or second-hand experience of a lot of people dying due to COVID, and this being a lot worse than your average seasonal flu.
Yes, I would agree with that.
So, it doesn't make sense to me. I also initially said that lockdown is going to cost lives, right? I'm absolutely convinced that it will. The thing is, it will. I didn't think that those would be acute deaths that would happen immediately. People lose their jobs. The starvation, the malnutrition, all of those consequences are long-term consequences that would maybe materialize in 2 or 3 or 5 years' time. The whole thing, and you've actually said that somewhere. That you said that the real killer fear is or panic is what killed people. Correct. I don't understand that at all.
So I'll give you an example.
People? How did panic give people COVID? How do you end up on oxygen?
Let me answer. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that went out the window here, when I distinctly remember when I picked up the phone to a group risk officer of one of the major financial institutions in South Africa, in order to have a conversation with him about why there was such panic being sown and why there was this disparity between the media narrative and the actual statistics. This is what he told me. He told me that their charity was investing in a technology to put the patients in perspex boxes in order to protect the medical professionals. This thing was being viewed as an airborne Ebola. A 35-year-old doctor is under no unusual risk. Yet, many 35-year-old doctors in this country believe that their lives have been in mortal peril since this epidemic emerged. And what that has done, one of the things that this has done, has been to virtually deny anybody early treatment for the onset of this disease. It's been clearly shown that this disease has two phases, and if you enter the inflammatory phase and do not treat it until you're required to be hospitalized, you are in very bad shape. So what we've effectively done is shut down solid, normal medical practice by panic. Doctors should have been seeing their patients as normal and treating them as normal, treating the patient in front of them. Instead,
I would agree with that.
Yeah. Instead, what we've had is an effective denial of early treatment. Every time somebody presents an idea that could threaten the emergency use authorization of these vaccines, there is a massive concerted effort to undo it, whether it's hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin or vitamin D or any one of a number of other less famous proposed treatments. There have been incredible efforts made to disparage the doctors who present those ideas, going so far as to present completely bogus papers to journals such as The Lancet, which promptly go on to accept the papers. We find only later that those methodologies are deeply flawed, that they were actually designed to make the drug look like it had a poor performance, and the papers end up being retracted. But by then it's too late. The damage is done. The rules have been made in countries outlawing the use of these treatments.
Okay,
and
so why would
features of a mania?
Can you explain to me why this would happen then? For what reason would people say prohibit ivermectin?
So in order to maintain an emergency use authorization, if your ideology is that...
But an emergency use authorization does not depend on ivermectin for a vaccine. It doesn't.
Yes,
a vaccine and a treatment are not the same thing.
No, yes. If the emergency use authorizations are granted premised on the lack of any available treatments.
Right, for vaccines?
Yes.
Okay, I'll have to read that because I don't believe that's the case. I do not believe that approving ivermectin as a treatment. So what happens with other COVID treatments? There are a number of COVID treatments that are being used. Are they just authorizing the ineffective ones in order to justify in order to keep the vaccines going?
So I mean, you'd have to ask the SAPRA people themselves why. But I mean, if that isn't the reason, I'll be very surprised. It's now like, I think, the cumulative weight of evidence for the effectiveness of ivermectin, and we don't sit there claiming that this thing is the be all and end all, but the evidence in favor of its effectiveness is considerably more than the evidence in favor of lockdowns or mask mandates or any of the measures that have been utilized, and probably even for the vaccines themselves, and especially in light of the concerns that I raised earlier. And yet this ban continues. What would you say is the explanation for that?
Look, I can tell you what I don't think is the explanation. I haven't been convinced by the studies on ivermectin that I have seen. I've always thought it looks like a promising thing that ought to be better studied, specifically for use against COVID. I haven't been entirely convinced by the studies, as a lot of people have. Now, look, it might be plausible, and I've heard this often, have heard this said a few times, that Merck, which is the original maker of ivermectin, has the FDA in its pocket and is punting a profitable new drug instead of off-patent ivermectin. It's plausible. I'm not sure that that's true, but it could be true. But why then would regulators in most other countries play along with this? Right? What possible motive could SAPRA have to deny the use of ivermectin as a treatment if it is indeed cheap, safe, and effective against COVID-19? I mean, South Africa has a long history of fighting against, these supposedly greedy international pharmaceuticals.
Have you looked at where the funding for these organizations comes from?
Now, all of a sudden, you're going to tell me Gates, aren't you?
An investor in vaccines, and a person who has got this ideological commitment to vaccines as the be-all and end-all of public health policy.
Okay, so SAPRA is now marching to Gates's drum.
I think it's almost impossible for anybody in these institutions to stand up and contradict the mantras of the World Health Organization and the Gates Foundation. I think it's almost impossible. And they are heavily funded, Ivo. there isn't an institution or university in the country that does not earn an amount of money that they could not afford to lose through the patronage of these organizations. They are not free to speak their minds. We have seen real evidence of what happens to the people in those organizations who do. There is a cancel culture in operation here that is unprecedented in the history of modern science. You cannot raise a voice without risking livelihood and, in fact, probably your entire career. If
so
you
it is
a
conspiracy. It is a conspiracy.
No, that's not a conspiracy. It's an incentive system.
Klaus Schwab and Bill Gates.
It's not a conspiracy, Ivo. A conspiracy is a secret plan to do something. This is the ideology of these people, and this is how they behave, and they tell you that they behave that way. There's no conspiracy.
No, it is a conspiracy. Conspiracy doesn't have to be secret. Conspiracy just means that people coordinate in order for this plan to work. So this whole thing is coordinated by what? No. Bill Gates and Klaus Schwab.
So no, it's not coordinated by them either. It's an ideological thing. It's what if you get people who all think in the same direction, and this is what I've been saying. There's a kind of dogma that is adhered to by many people in many organizations, and it is the playing out of that dogma, which is what we are seeing. And the dogma is not rooted in realism. The dogma is false. The dogma is a dogma of centralization, of surveillance, technocratic healthcare, and that is what is being rolled out. And if you happen to be the person in one of these organizations who sticks their hands up and has the temerity to point out that natural immunity is superior to vaccine immunity, good luck with you. You will be out on your ear within weeks. That is what is happening.
So let me just perhaps give another example. I think of what Nick is trying to point to. So I'm thinking now of the lab leak hypothesis, which went around. Some people talked about in the early days, but then it kind of died down. And there was this great long piece written by journalist Nicholas Wade about how this guy Peter Daszak had used Lancet and an op-ed there to kind of squash down some of the dissent. So I guess what Nick is saying is that he thinks a similar thing is occurring in a lot of these institutions. Ivo, I don't know how much you engaged that debate, but what do you think of that?
The thing is, I did look at the lab leak debate, and it looked at one point recently that it was sort of revived as a theory, and it was a very good article written in I can't even remember the publication it was now. But then I've also seen some very good counter arguments written. So it's still up in the air. People just don't know. The thing is, there are political implications to it being a lab leak, right? So I can well imagine that there is political pressure for people to suppress certain stories, certain investigations, because it looks pretty ugly if the US turns out if it turns out the NHI has been funding a lab in China, which turned out to be breaking bottles full of deadly viruses in the street. So, I don't think this is the same thing, though, because I really cannot see a motive for South African doctors, South African regulators to go along with, some sort of conspiracy to keep Merck rich or to keep pharmaceutical companies in vaccine profits. In fact, the whole vaccine profit thing doesn't even make sense.
Their market caps have shot up by billions, Ivo.
Actually, not so much. I've looked at their market caps, and they're not that great. Pfizer is actually down since the beginning of the.
Okay, but I mean,
correctly, Pfizer is down.
The drugs are manufactured.
Johnson & Johnson is 11% up since the beginning of the pandemic. The thing is, vaccines is a very small part of the pharmaceutical company's revenue, right? It is less profitable, significantly less profitable than their non-vaccine drugs. Right? If they were plotting to make a lot of money, right, they might plot a pandemic, absolutely, but they would not plot producing vaccines to cure that pandemic, because they make much more money treating people who are sick. So preventing people from getting sick is there's just not the same amount of money in that. The whole idea that this is a huge plot to profit the pharmaceutical companies makes no sense to me.
No, I mean, I don't think it's a huge plot. That's the starting point of my suggestion. There's a dogma, there's an ideology at work here, and the pharmaceutical firms and the Gates Foundation and the World Health Organization are so deeply, and all our regulators are so deeply intertwined and speaking this language, and so unable to the point that any scientist in those organizations is unable to present a dissenting view. This is the truth. We cannot. I can give you multiple examples of this. Whenever we come up with a suggestion, there's just this uniform wall of response from all of these entities. Then when the suggestion turns out later to have become true, do you get any kind of acknowledgement that there was something wrong in the analysis? For example, the airborne transmission that we spoke about earlier, the universal susceptibility challenge. When I initially said, look, it's obvious from the emerging data that we do not have universal susceptibility, I was called a conspiracy theorist then. I've been called a conspiracy theorist for a great many things, okay? That has now been the subject of dozens and dozens of papers. The mechanisms that we proposed were absolutely spot on. We were exactly right about what those mechanisms will look like. They've now been demonstrated all over the place. I still hear people in these medical organizations maintaining that we're all universally susceptible. It is unbelievable, the extent of dogma and narrative and the unwillingness of scientists in the face of, no matter how much evidence they are presented with, to stand up and say, right, this is wrong, we need to change what we're doing here. It simply is not happening. If those scientists did what PANDA did about the second wave and actually came out with a mea culpa and an analysis of what had gone wrong, then we'd be in an entirely different position. We wouldn't be doing these stupid lockdowns and booze bans and mask mandates. This would all have gone away in May last year.
Can I perhaps move us on, because we are pretty close to time now. So I want to move us to where maybe this is all going. So I think Boris Johnson has done something quite interesting in the past couple of days. He said that our vaccination program has de-linked rising cases from deaths. And based on my very uneducated BA from Wits degree, in reading that data, that kind of looks like the case. The rising cases in the UK don't seem to have turned into deaths, and that they're moving away from lockdown pretty much completely. So my question, I'll start with you, Nick, and then I'll get Ivo as well on this. Do you think that the idea of lockdowns is actually going to just be abandoned by most countries? I mean, there are a lot of people who I think are very invested in the idea. I would not dispute that at all. But it seems to me like the political currents are so strongly pushing against furthering lockdowns into 2022 that these things are kind of going to be forgotten. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, the salient moment here was Biden and others calling the governors of Texas, Florida, and a couple of other states who opened up abandoned lockdowns, abandoned mask mandates, Neanderthals. And a whole bevy of these conflicted and corrupted scientists coming out and predicting catastrophe as a result of those complete relaxations of restrictions. This took place many months ago. No such tragedies have emerged. We now know that it is safe to completely abandon these ridiculous control measures which have been demonstrated not to work. Okay, so the facts are known. What is stopping other countries from abandoning their measures? I believe it has a lot to do with the coercive practice towards universal vaccination. I think if you look at how the UK behaved, they kept on holding it out and blaming the non-vaccinated people for the inability to lift restrictions. This was ridiculous. It flies in the face of all the evidence, and anybody looking at that, I believe, should make a severe moral judgment on what was done there. I worry that this is going to be a feature of our environment, that we will continue cycling into periods of lockdown and continuation of these crazy mask mandates, including wearing of masks outdoors, which defies all scientific logic. And we will find that Australia and many other countries behave in exactly this fashion. So yes, it's good. Anytime a country leaves this bizarre clown world that our public health institutions have led us into is a good thing, in my opinion. And I won't ever sing the praises of Boris Johnson. He's been a flat-out disaster. But it is good that the UK has lifted restrictions. Of course, it still has online learning for universities. It still has a red list and travel restrictions and quarantines on visitors and a whole host of things which achieve precisely zero. And I would hope that those things will be lifted soon as well. But what is going on now in Australia, for example, is completely ridiculous. What is going on now in many countries in the Far East is completely ridiculous. And I believe that we need to begin to separate out these issues and stop this relentless march towards the immunity passport.
Ivo, what's your take? Do you think that we are on an inevitable march for this, or do you think the political impetus here is kind of falling apart?
I'm not sure that it's only a political impetus. Look, I do agree that a lot of the lockdown measures are ridiculous. You know, as I said right at the beginning, I agree with Glenda Gray. I believe that some basic non-pharmaceutical interventions are a very good idea and ought to be certainly strongly recommended. But you know, I don't like the idea of crowds and so on. I wouldn't be going out in the middle of a third wave to a music concert, for example. Look, South Africa's daily number of deaths right now is higher than the daily number of confirmed deaths in the United States, right? Despite the fact that they've got a population 5.5 times bigger than ours. US death numbers have fallen off a cliff since the beginning of the year, right? The chart goes literally straight down, thanks to vaccinations. Same with the UK, right? Ours have not, right? Instead, we got a third wave. And our daily number of confirmed deaths per million people is now among the highest in the world. It's comparable to those in South America, but higher than those in every single country in North America, Europe, Asia, Australasia, and even the rest of Africa, if you don't count Namibia and Tunisia. And what is different about South Africa? We are lagging far, far behind the rest of the world with vaccinations. Right? I think that really getting a move on with vaccinations, getting half the population or 2/3 of the population vaccinated, that is what will convince governments to lift lockdown regulations and lockdown restrictions. That is the way out of this. We're not going to convince them that they were wrong in the first place with lockdowns, right? They were, but we're not going to convince them. What will change things is serious vaccination campaigns, getting a lot of people vaccinated. That is what is changing things in the UK and the US.
Can I find the common ground here? I agree with you that at the moment, as things stand, that vaccinations are an important part of the process, provided that these studies are not in fact as problematic. So assuming that vaccinations stand up for the vulnerable people, what you need to do is vaccinate the non-recovered vulnerable. It's 10% of the population. At that point, you should be bringing deaths down to a negligible level if the vaccines work. There's no need to vaccinate 60, 70% of the population. We already have 50 or 60% who have recovered. They're good. They're solid. They won't get COVID. And you need to vaccinate the proportion of the vulnerable who have not yet recovered. And that's a very small proportion of the population. So I don't agree that, I mean, I agree with the principle that vaccination has a role to play. But I do not agree with it needing to be 50 or 60% or 70% or 80% as a number that's bandied about. That entails vaccinating all of the adult population and half of the children's population, and it just makes no sense.
And that's where we do disagree. I do think that widespread vaccination, as widespread as possible, is a very good idea.
I
don't think that only old people are vulnerable. I mean, my wife lost 2 colleagues, both were in their 40s, both were pretty healthy. 2 close colleagues that died of COVID. It's not only the elderly that are vulnerable, or only the ones with comorbidities. A lot of people in their 30s and 40s are also vulnerable. well, 40s and 50s. By 30s, you start being a bit more safe.
Yeah. Okay. So then let's split the difference. I mean, we can argue about the risk rates by age, but would you agree that vaccinating non-recovered individuals above, pick your age, you want to say 45, that's fine. Vaccinating non-recovered individuals,
I think the strategy that we have right now of prioritizing by age, seeing as we don't have the competency to prioritize by underlying conditions. Just prioritizing by age, I think that is a good strategy, and then we'll see how far we get.
No, but what about non-recovered?
I mean, that would be. I can't comment on that. The last time I saw a paper on that was last year, end of last year, and it suggested that vaccination immunity was in fact stronger than natural immunity. And natural immunity might wane fairly quickly, but I really can't comment. I haven't seen the recent science on it.
I sent you PANDA's argument that article that details all of the recent science right up to date. Go and have a read of that, because I think this is very important. If vaccines are a scarce commodity, and if our ability to roll out is constrained, then what we should be doing, the public health messaging should be: you're good to go if you've recovered. You do not need to line up for the vaccine. Let's focus on getting the elderly, non-recovered, and the comorbid non-recovered into the vaccine queue. And so, that would then be done in weeks.
And practically, how would that work? Would people then have to go and get antibody tests or something to prove that they're recovered?
Most people not to prove. You see, why would we have to prove? If people know that they've had COVID, they simply don't line up. You're thinking with the mindset of a mandate, and that everybody's ultimately going to end up needing to demonstrate their immune status. Why would that be necessary? If you've vaccinated the people who are susceptible, then your deaths go down to negligible levels, and we can all stop this nonsense.
Look, and I've also seen people who've had COVID who get it a second time. So I'm not convinced by that. I certainly want to see more widespread vaccinations than you do.
That flies in the face of the science, and I think has more to do with the very unscientific business of testing people on PCR, CTs up to 45, asymptomatics, etc., etc. I think the scientific literature on the rarity of or the rareness, I'm not sure which word is correct, of second bouts of COVID is quite comprehensive. It's an extremely unusual event.
Okay, our PCRs is another whole rabbit hole that I don't think we should go down.
We haven't got time.
Yeah, I think we are out of time. So thank you very much, gentlemen, for both coming on and giving robust views on and having a proper discussion and a proper debate about this kind of thing, about these very real disagreements. And I think it's good because, of course, it's always good to hear people talking about things and arguing about facts and what's true. So thank you very much to both of you.
Nicholas, thank you very much. I mean, this is only the third such discussion I've managed to have, and that is part of the problem here. We should be engaging in discussion. I can change my mind. Ivo can change his mind. We can have a mature and decent discussion, but those discussions, we've been unable to get people to engage. We've been unable to get members of the public health institution to answer questions or to enter into debates, and that speaks volumes, I believe, for the problem that they have, which is that they are not actually basing their policy recommendations on science.
All right, thank you very much
for hosting us, Nicholas.
Yeah, no, it was a pleasure, and we will see you guys on another episode of the Daily Friend Show. We hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you there. Cheers.